attention to what you're seeing right here. This is body cam footage from Officer Ryan Mitchell's camera, captured the moment he and his partner rounded the corner of Rosewood Drive. Look at that white cottage. See those red splatters covering the entire front of the house? That's blood, arterial spray, cast-off patterns, impact spatter, all on the outside of the home. In just moments, these officers are about to walk through that door and discover something that will shake this quiet neighborhood to its core. What they find inside will lead to one of the most disturbing cases of betrayal and calculated murder their department has ever seen. This is the story of how trusted neighbors became cold-blooded killers. You know that feeling when you finally find your perfect retirement spot? That little slice of heaven where you can grow tomatoes in the backyard, wave to neighbors on evening walks, and finally just breathe after decades of work? For Katherine and William Harrison, that feeling became their reality when they moved to 1247 Rosewood Drive in Elmwood, Oregon, back in 2014. Katherine was 63, a former elementary school teacher with silver hair she always wore in a neat bun. William was 65, a retired postal worker who still woke up at 5 a.m. every morning out of habit. They were the kind of people who remembered everyone's birthday, who left their porch light on for the neighborhood kids on Halloween, and who hosted a legendary 4th of July barbecue every summer. Their modest white cottage with the diamond-paned windows became a landmark on the street, the house where you could always count on a friendly wave and a kind word. Across the street lived Brian and Jessica Montgomery. Brian was 36, stocky, always wearing flannel shirts even in summer. Jessica was 34, blonde, sharp-featured, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. They'd moved in about a year after the Harrisons, and the two couples had quickly become close. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. Here's the thing about small neighborhoods. Everyone knows everyone's business. But sometimes the darkest secrets hide right out in the open, disguised as normalcy. And on the night of March 8, 2017, those secrets would explode into violence so brutal that it would leave an entire community questioning everything they thought they knew about the people living next door. March 8, 2017, started like any other Wednesday in Elmwood. Katherine had spent the morning tending to her rose garden. William had driven to the hardware store for some supplies. Neighbors reported seeing them both throughout the day. Nothing unusual, nothing that raised any red flags. But here's what made that evening different. At 9:47 p.m., dispatch received a 911 call from an elderly woman 3 houses down. She was frantic, barely coherent. "There's screaming," she told the operator. "Terrible screaming coming from the Harrison house, and I think I heard something breaking. Please send someone." Officer Ryan Mitchell and his partner, Officer David Torres, were the first to respond. They'd been patrolling the area, less than a mile away. The call came through as a possible domestic disturbance, nothing that prepared them for what they were about to find. Let me paint you a picture of what that body cam footage captured. As the officers pulled up to Rosewood Drive, their headlights swept across the quiet residential street. Normal houses, normal yards, normal everything. But then their lights hit 1247, and both officers stopped dead in their tracks. The entire front of the Harrison cottage was splattered with blood. Not droplets, not smears, massive arterial sprays that had hit the white siding with such force that red droplets were still dripping down to the grass below. The porch light illuminated the carnage like a spotlight on a crime scene, which is exactly what it was. "Control, we're going to need backup," Mitchell radioed in, his voice steady but tight. "And forensics. Lots of forensics." Torres drew his weapon. Mitchell did the same. The front door was slightly ajar, hanging crooked on its hinges like someone had kicked it or thrown their body weight against it. Through the gap, they could see darkness inside. No lights, no movement, no sound. "Police! We're coming in!" Mitchell announced, pushing the door open with his foot. The smell hit them first. Copper, heavy and metallic. The unmistakable scent of fresh blood. So much blood that it had pooled in the entryway, seeping into the hardwood floors. Mitchell's body cam swept across the living room, and that's when they saw Katherine. She was on the floor near the couch, lying on her side in a position that made it clear she'd been running, trying to get away from someone. Her floral dress was soaked through with blood. The coffee table was overturned, picture frames smashed, lamps knocked over, clear signs of a violent struggle. "We've got one victim down," Torres said into his radio, his voice cracking slightly. "Female, appears to be deceased." Continuing to clear the house. They found William in the kitchen. He was slumped against the refrigerator, a trail of blood showing where he'd tried to crawl, tried to escape, tried to survive. His hands were defensive wounds, deep gashes across his palms where he'd tried to fight off his attacker. The kitchen told its own horror story. Blood on the walls, blood on the ceiling, blood on the countertops. Whatever had happened here had been prolonged, brutal, and personal. But here's what made it even more horrific. The back door was wide open, swinging slightly in the night breeze. Fresh footprints in blood led from William's body through the kitchen and out into the backyard. Someone had been here recently, very recently, and they'd walked right out the back like they owned the place. Within 20 minutes, Rosewood Drive looked like something out of a movie. Police cars, ambulances, forensic vans, crime scene tape stretched across 3 properties. Neighbors emerged from their homes in bathrobes and pajamas, faces pale with shock, clutching each other as they watched investigators swarm the Harrison cottage. Detective Sarah Chen was the lead investigator assigned to the case. She'd been with Elmwood PD for 15 years, worked dozens of homicides, but even she had to take a moment when she walked into that house. "This wasn't a robbery," she told her partner, Detective Marcus Williams, as they surveyed the scene. "Look around. Television's still here. Jewelry box on the bedroom dresser is untouched. This was personal. Someone wanted them dead, and they wanted them to suffer." The medical examiner's preliminary findings supported that theory. Katherine had been struck multiple times with a large bladed weapon. Early estimates suggested a machete or similar tool. The attack had been frontal, meaning she'd seen her killer coming. William's wounds were even more extensive, suggesting he'd put up a fight before being overwhelmed. Time of death was estimated between 8:30 and 9:30 p.m., which meant the killer had been in that house, committing murder while neighbors were home having dinner, watching television, living their normal lives just yards away. But here's what haunted everyone on the investigative team. The blood on the outside of the house, that arterial spray that had caught the officers' attention, it had come from inside. Someone had opened the windows during the attack, or the violence had been so extreme that blood had literally sprayed through the screens and onto the siding. It suggested a level of brutality that went beyond a simple killing. This was rage. This was hatred. This was someone who wanted Katherine and William Harrison to suffer as much as humanly possible before they died. As dawn broke over Elmwood on March 9th, Detective Chen stood in the Harrisons' blood-soaked living room and knew one thing for certain. Whoever did this knew these people, and they were probably still very, very close by. The investigation kicked into high gear before the sun even rose. Forensic teams photographed every inch of the crime scene. They collected blood samples, fingerprints, fibers, anything that might lead them to a killer. The back door was dusted for prints. The bloody footprints were measured and photographed. Everything was cataloged, bagged, and sent to the lab. Meanwhile, Detective Chen began the difficult task of interviewing the neighbors. Most were still in shock, unable to process that something so violent had happened in their quiet neighborhood. But shock has a way of making people remember details they might otherwise overlook, and Chen knew how to ask the right questions. The elderly woman who'd called 911, Martha Phillips, lived 3 houses down. She was 78, a widow who spent most evenings reading in her living room with the window cracked open. "I heard Katherine scream," she told Chen, her hands shaking around a cup of tea. "It wasn't like a surprise scream, you know? It was terror, pure terror. And then I heard breaking glass and more screaming and—" She trailed off, tears streaming down her face. "I should have called sooner. I should have done something." "You did everything right," Chen assured her. "Did you see anyone leaving the house? Any cars you didn't recognize?" Martha shook her head. "But there was something earlier, around 8:15, maybe 8:30. I saw someone walking up the Harrisons' driveway. I didn't think anything of it at the time because it looked like one of the neighbors. Can you describe them? Stocky build, wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see their face. Martha paused. But they went around to the back door. That struck me as odd now that I think about it. Why wouldn't they use the front door? Other neighbors reported similar observations. A couple 2 doors down had seen someone in the Harrisons' backyard around sunset. A teenager across the street had noticed the Montgomerys' living room lights were off, which was unusual for a weeknight. The Montgomerys. Detective Chen's attention zeroed in on Brian and Jessica Montgomery. They lived directly across the street, had a clear view of the Harrison home, and yet they hadn't called 911. They hadn't reported hearing anything unusual. In fact, when officers knocked on their door that night to ask if they'd witnessed anything, Jessica had answered in her pajamas, claiming they'd been asleep since 9 p.m. Something didn't sit right about that. Chen and Williams drove to the Montgomery residence the next morning. Brian answered the door, looking haggard, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes. "We need to ask you some questions about last night," Chen said. "We already told the officers we didn't see anything," Brian replied, his voice defensive. "Mind if we come in?" Brian hesitated just a second too long before stepping aside. The Montgomery home was strange. That's the word Chen would use later in her report. It was too clean, almost obsessively so. The living room looked like a furniture showroom, nothing personal, nothing lived in, but it was the smell that caught Chen's attention, a sharp chemical scent, like bleach, barely masked by air freshener. Jessica emerged from the kitchen, looking equally exhausted. "Is this really necessary?" she asked. "We're grieving." "Katherine and William were our friends." "That's actually what we wanted to talk about," William said. "How well did you know the Harrisons?" "Very well," Jessica said quickly. "We had dinner together once a month. They were lovely people." "Did they have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt them?" Brian and Jessica exchanged a glance. It was quick, barely perceptible, but Chen caught it. "Not that we know of," Brian said. Chen pulled out her notepad. "Where were you both last night between 8 and 10 p.m.? "Here," Jessica said. "We were home all evening. Brian was watching television, I was doing some work on my laptop, and we went to bed around 9. "Did you hear anything unusual from across the street?" "No," they both said in unison. That was strike one. Multiple neighbors had heard screaming loud enough to call 911, but the people living directly across the street, with a clear line of sight to the Harrison home, had heard nothing. "What about security cameras?" Chen asked, gesturing to the camera mounted above their front door. Brian's jaw tightened. "It's been broken for a few weeks. We've been meaning to fix it." Strike two. As the detectives left the Montgomery home, Williams turned to Chen. "That was hinky as hell." "The bleach smell bothered me more," Chen replied. "Who deep cleans their house the day after their neighbors get murdered?" The next 24 hours brought the investigation into sharp focus. The forensic lab worked overtime processing evidence from the scene, and what they found started to build a damning picture. The bloody footprints leading out the back door, size 11 men's work boots. Brian Montgomery wore size 11. The prints matched a specific brand sold at a local outdoor supply store. Detectives pulled purchase records and found Brian had bought that exact style of boot 3 months earlier. The fingerprints on the back door? Mostly smudged, but they managed to lift a partial. It would take time to run through the database, but it was something. But here's what changed everything. Katherine and William Harrison had a security system. Not a fancy one, just a basic wireless camera that William had installed above their back porch last summer. The camera had been knocked offline during the attack, probably deliberately, but the footage uploaded to a cloud storage account automatically. On March 10th, a forensic tech working through the Harrisons' digital footprint found the account, and when Detective Chen watched that footage, her blood ran cold. The camera had captured everything, not the interior of the house, but the backyard. And critically, it had caught the killer arriving and leaving. At 8:23 p.m., a figure appeared at the edge of the frame, walking up the Harrisons' driveway toward the back door. Dark hoodie, dark pants, carrying something long and wrapped in cloth. The person's face wasn't visible, but their build matched Brian Montgomery's perfectly. The figure tried the back door. It was locked, then pulled out something small. 30 seconds later, the door swung open. Lock-picking or a key. Either way, this person had come prepared. The timestamp showed the figure entering the house at 8:26 p.m. At 9:18 p.m., the same figure emerged. No more wrapped package. They were now carrying what was clearly a machete, blood visible even in the low-light footage. The person walked calmly, methodically, down the driveway and out of frame. But the truly chilling part, just before the person disappeared, they stopped, turned, and looked directly back at the house. And in that moment, the porch light caught their profile just enough. It was Brian Montgomery. "We've got him," Chen said, her voice tight with controlled rage. "Get me a warrant, now!" The arrest warrant for Brian Montgomery was issued at 3:47 a.m. on March 11th. Detective Chen wanted the element of surprise, wanted to catch him before he could destroy more evidence or, worse, run. 6 police vehicles descended on the Montgomery residence just after 4 a.m. Officers surrounded the property, guns drawn, every exit blocked. Chen herself knocked on the door, her badge held high. "Brian Montgomery, this is the Elmwood Police Department. We have a warrant for your arrest. Open the door." For a long moment, nothing. Then shuffling sounds inside, a light flicking on, and finally the door opened. Brian stood there in sweatpants and a t-shirt, looking like he'd just rolled out of bed. But his eyes were wide, alert, almost like he'd been expecting this. "Brian Montgomery, you're under arrest for the murders of Katherine and William Harrison." Jessica appeared behind him, her face a mask of shock. "What? Brian, what's happening?" As officers cuffed Brian and led him to the patrol car, Chen stayed behind with Jessica. "We need to search the house," she said, presenting the warrant. Jessica's shock seemed genuine. She stammered, protested, claimed there must be some mistake. But Chen had been doing this long enough to know that shock could be manufactured. The search of the Montgomery residence yielded a treasure trove of evidence. In the garage, hidden behind boxes of Christmas decorations, they found a machete. It had been cleaned, but luminol revealed blood residue in the handle grooves. The blade had been wiped down, but forensic analysis would later prove microscopic blood traces matched Katherine and William Harrison's DNA. In Brian's workshop in the basement, they found the clothes he'd worn. He'd tried to burn them in the backyard fire pit, but pieces remained. Charred fabric with blood spatter patterns that told the story of the attack. But the most damning evidence was digital. Brian's cell phone, which he'd carelessly left charging on his nightstand, contained a deleted text thread with Jessica. The forensic tech recovered it within hours, and what those texts revealed turned this from a murder case into something far more sinister. The texts went back months, 6 months to be exact, and they detailed everything. Jessica, January 15th, 2017. "We can't keep doing this, the risk is too high." Brian, January 15th, 2017. "We're being careful, they'll never know." Jessica, February 3rd, 2017. "What if Margaret figures it out?" Brian, February 3rd, 2017. "She won't, and if she does, we'll handle it." Jessica, March 7th, 2017. "Katherine knows. She told me this morning she's calling the police tomorrow. We have to do something now." Brian, March 7th, 2017. "I'll take care of it." Jessica, March 7th, 2017. "Make sure there's nothing left. No evidence." What were the Montgomerys hiding? What had Katherine discovered that was worth killing for? The answer was in their basement. Behind a false wall in the Montgomerys' finished basement, investigators found a sophisticated operation. Tables covered with pill bottles, scales, packaging materials. The Montgomerys had been running an illegal prescription drug distribution ring, getting pills from fraudulent prescriptions and selling them online and to local dealers. It was a lucrative operation. Bank records would later show they'd made over $300,000 in the past year alone. Katherine Harrison, the former teacher, the kind woman who baked cookies for the neighborhood, had figured it out. Maybe she'd seen too many packages coming and going. Maybe she'd overheard something. The text suggested she'd confronted Jessica on March 7th and had given her an ultimatum. Turn yourselves in, or I'm calling the police in the morning. So they decided to eliminate the problem. During his interrogation, Brian eventually broke. It took 6 hours, but Chen was patient, methodical, laying out evidence piece by piece until Brian's story crumbled. Jessica planned everything, he said finally, his voice hollow. She said it had to be done. Katherine was going to destroy everything we'd built. Jessica told me exactly how to do it, when to do it, where to strike. And you just followed orders? Chen asked, her voice dripping with disgust. She's my wife. She said we had no choice. But here's what made detectives' skin crawl. The text revealed Jessica had watched the entire murder unfold from her living room window. She'd sat there, in the dark, with a direct view into the Harrison home, and she'd coached Brian through text messages. Jessica, March 8th, 8:47 p.m. Kitchen now, don't leave any witnesses. Jessica, March 8th, 9:03 p.m. Finish it, someone might have heard. Jessica, March 8th, 9:16 p.m. Back door, leave now, destroy the weapon. She'd orchestrated a double homicide like she was directing a play, calm and detached, while her husband butchered 2 innocent people with a machete. Jessica Montgomery was arrested later that same day. Unlike Brian, she didn't break during interrogation. She sat in that interview room for 8 hours, arms crossed, refusing to speak without her lawyer. But the evidence didn't need her confession. The security footage that Officer Mitchell's body cam had captured, that blood-splattered cottage that had shocked the entire neighborhood, became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. They showed the jury that footage in the opening statement, making sure they understood the violence, the brutality, the absolute horror of what had been done to Katherine and William Harrison. They showed the security footage from the Harrisons' own camera, the figure with the machete calmly walking away. They presented the text messages, the DNA evidence, the financial records showing motive. They brought in neighbors who testified about the Montgomery's suspicious behavior and the Harrisons' character. Martha Phillips, the elderly woman who'd called 911, testified through tears. Katherine was the sweetest person I've ever known, she said. She didn't deserve what happened to her. No one deserves that. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Both Brian and Jessica Montgomery were found guilty on all counts. The verdicts came down in September 2017. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors from Rosewood Drive, members of the Harrisons' extended family, journalists, and curious onlookers all came to witness justice being served. When the judge asked if either defendant had anything to say before sentencing, Brian stood and apologized, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica remained silent, her face impassive, showing no remorse whatsoever. Here's where the legal system finally caught up with their evil. Brian Montgomery was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, burglary in the first degree, and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Jessica Montgomery was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder as an accomplice, conspiracy to commit murder, and operating an illegal drug distribution network. She received 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 20 years for the drug charges. The Elmwood community was shattered by the revelations. How had this happened? How had 2 seemingly normal people been running a drug operation right under everyone's noses? How had trusted neighbors turned into monsters? The Harrisons' daughter Emily spoke at the sentencing hearing. "My parents spent their entire lives being kind to others," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. They welcomed the Montgomerys into their home, into their lives, never knowing that these people would repay that kindness with murder. I hope every day of their life sentences, they remember what they took from this world. They didn't just kill 2 people, they killed the embodiment of goodness and trust. 1,247 Rosewood Drive sat empty for 2 years. No one wanted to buy the house where such horror had occurred. Eventually, a developer purchased it, tore it down completely, and built a small memorial garden on the site. A bench sits there now, with a plaque that reads, "In loving memory of Katherine and William Harrison, who believed in the goodness of neighbors." The Montgomery house across the street was sold at auction, the proceeds going to victims' restitution. A young family lives there now, completely unaware of the darkness that once resided within those walls. For the officers who responded that night, particularly Ryan Mitchell, whose body cam captured those first shocking moments, the case left scars. Mitchell eventually transferred to a different department, unable to drive down Rosewood Drive without seeing that blood-splattered cottage in his mind. Detective Sarah Chen keeps a photo of Katherine and William Harrison on her desk, not a crime scene photo, but one from better days, both of them smiling at a neighborhood barbecue. "They deserve to be remembered as they lived," she says, "not how they died." And that's how we should remember them too. Katherine Harrison, 63 years old, beloved teacher, gardener, neighbor, and friend. William Harrison, 65 years old, dedicated postal worker, handyman, host of legendary 4th of July celebrations. Two people who opened their hearts and their home to their neighbors, never imagining that kindness would be their downfall. The Montgomerys may have destroyed their lives, but they couldn't destroy their legacy. The people of Elmwood still gather every 4th of July, keeping alive the tradition the Harrisons started, making sure that love and community triumph over the darkness that tried to consume them. Rest in peace, Katherine and William. Your neighborhood will never forget you.